Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Ostler. My guest on today's podcast is my new friend and author, Dr. Matthew Harris. Welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thanks, Richard. I'm happy to be here today.
Just a little bit about, he is Dr. Harris. I'm going to call him Matt for the rest of the podcast, but I just wanted us to remember that about him. He's a historian. He's at Colorado State University in Pueblo. He's been there since 2005, so that's coming up on 20 years. He got a couple undergraduate degrees from BYU, got a PhD from Syracuse University in history, and has written a lot of books in looking at LDS Mormon history. I'm going to use the word Mormon because that's how we usually refer to Mormon history. I recognize the church is asking us to use Latter-day Saints, and I use that too, but he has written a book called Second Class Saints, Blacks, Mormons, and the Struggle for Racial Equality. And I've had a lot of authors on the podcast, and maybe 1 out of 10 I've had time to read their book before the podcast because I've got this gigantic stack, and we still get authors on the podcast, but I just sort of say I haven't read your book. But Matthew's different. I've been hearing about this book for a while, and I did read it over the last month, and it's one of the very finest books I've read. And I learned so much about LDS church history around the priesthood ban, and my respect for historians continues to grow because of their work, really fact-based work to get to the primary sources to tell us the story of what really went on without kind of an agenda. And so I'm just honored to have Matt on the podcast. I've been looking forward to this, so that's kind of the overview of the podcast, and I hope what Matt shares with you will help you better understand the priesthood ban and cause you to read his book, and then maybe cause you to think, what can I do in my circle of influence to improve the experience for Latter-day Saints on the margins? Is that okay for an introduction, Matt?
That's great, Richard. I appreciate that.
So I'm going to start with some questions. Why did you write the book?
Well, it's part of our faith tradition, and I served a mission. So I'm from Maine, grew up in Maine, but I served a mission to Idaho. And as is the case with missionaries, at least back in the late 80s when I served, and early 90s, not so certain about today, questions of race that come up with missionaries. But back when I was a missionary, the ban had just ended a decade prior, and we still had questions from Black and biracial people in Idaho that we taught. And I just remember feeling profoundly uncomfortable with the traditional lines that the church used. I'm sure most of these lines are familiar with your audience. One would be, of course, that Black people bore this biblical curse. And I never felt comfortable as a 19-year-old young man, white young man, telling this Black man that, oh, God said you were cursed. That never sat right with me. And the other, of course, another rationale was the less valiant one, that Black people were less valiant in pre-existence. Try telling that to a Black person with a straight face. That didn't set well. The other one that, the 2 other examples that I think we missionaries gave would be that God privileged certain people for blessings in biblical times, and so it is here. Black people just had to wait. That didn't set right either. That doesn't seem like a just God that I know, especially when you're dealing with one's salvation. And then finally, the other one that we talked about and used, that's still being used today in the church, regrettably, is we don't know why the ban began. And in my book, I tried to contextualize that. And it's a throwaway PR line that the Brethren used for the first time in December of 1969 when they wrote a First Presidency statement, because one of the First Presidency counselors, President Hugh B. Brown, a man whom I greatly admire and love and respect. I'm knee-deep in a biography on Brother Brown now, so I've been thinking about him a lot, and my admiration grows with him each day that I read his journals and letters and writings, sermons. But President Brown was speaking to the press, as I articulate in Second Class Saints, and the Brethren got upset with that. He was telling the press that the ban would end, and that was the context for this 1969 First Presidency statement. And in that statement that the church ultimately published in January of 1970, the Church News, that they said that we don't know why the ban began. And it was just simply a way to get the critics off their backs. But, to suggest that the church didn't know why, that's hard, because Elder McConkie and President Joseph Fielding Smith and others were very emphatic about why the band began, because they wrote books about it. And then lastly, it's hard to digest that theologically when you're dealing with somebody's salvific ordinances and rights and their status in the afterlife, and to suggest that you just don't know why. I mean, that just doesn't set right. And so the "we don't know" line has always perplexed me, and I'm a little bothered that some of the brethren, not all, but some, are still perpetuating that line, because I don't think it's really sustained.
Yeah, that really comes clear through the book. I love that you had this personal experience in Idaho. So there's a personal story here, Matt, talking to Black people. And then I love that you want us to understand as a faith community the complexity of this. And I learned so much that I thought I didn't need to learn. Sometimes no one's taken me aside and said, "You need to unlearn these things, Richard Ostler, because this is what really went down, and this is what we really teach." And so that's one of the things that's really helped me. Talk about, who you hope will read it, and maybe what changes it creates in Latter-day Saint and our broader Latter-day Saint community.
Well, I wrote this paper for our people, or this book for our people, and I want Latter-day Saints to read this book. And it's I want people of all flavors in the church, whether they consider themselves, conservative or moderate or liberal. I definitely want Black and biracial Latter-day Saints to read this. And I've had so many Black and biracial Latter-day Saints reach out to me and say how much the book has helped to heal them. And, try telling a Black Latter-day Saint that we don't know why the band began. I mean, that just doesn't set well. It just comes across as so disingenuous. And so in some interesting way, my book has been a healing agent for them. And that really makes me happy. And I think one African-American woman just told me just this past weekend, she said, that we can't heal unless we have the truth. And this is what your book did for me. And that really made me happy in many ways. I also want the leaders to read the book. That, I'm a big believer that if we make mistakes, we're all human. We're all influenced by the context and the times in which we live. We make mistakes, we need to apologize and atone for those mistakes. And so I'm hoping that some leaders would do that. I can tell you, I've heard, I don't want to get into names, but I've heard from some general authorities who have read the book, one of whom read it last summer, and he had this running commentary all throughout August. Every chapter he would he would write me this 12-paragraph email. "This is what I learned. Woo!"
Good.
And I was delighted that it was interesting. I was delighted that he did this. And of course I wrote it back and I said, "No, make sure you share this with your colleagues."
Good.
And recently, I've heard this story secondhand, but a Black woman went into her bishop and she said, "Bishop, you got to read this book. It's by this Harris guy." And I don't know this person, but she was talking about how my book had affected her. And she's a Black woman, and she wanted her white bishop to read it. And he looked at her and smiled. And he said, "Not only have I read this," he kept it. He reached down out of the desk in his bishop's office and pulled it out and showed her. And I thought, wow, that's something. I mean, that really shows me that people are open to new ideas and they're open to scholarship, because I think ultimately when we're transparent, in the long run, it serves the church.
I love the healing message of your answer. And I thought all the pain ended in June of 1978 for Black Latter-day Saints in our faith community, and I was wrong. As I've listened to Black Latter-day Saints, and we'll get more into that, but I love the healing that's occurring because of the book, and hopefully apologizing is part of healing for people to apologize for. I apologize for the things I had thought about Black people. And I love that you're writing it also for leaders, because I think, we're not a perfect faith and we make mistakes. And I think if we, I'm come from the business world and we make mistakes that are business, and I don't usually fire somebody. I usually try to look at that as a learning experience and say, what systems are we going to put in place? It's especially if there were best efforts and somebody with integrity, what systems are we going to place to ensure we don't make that mistake again and actually recognize they become a more valuable employee because of the difficult experience and the mistake. So I love that people have greater influence in the church and writing policy and creating content are aware of the book and aware of the history of the ban. I didn't, we'll get into this, but it wasn't until Paul Reeve came on the podcast a year or two ago, a colleague of yours, I assume you know very, very well. I thought the ban started on day one, and I didn't realize that Joseph Smith didn't have a ban, and it started with Brigham Young, and that's what the Gospel Talk essay that he was so instrumental in writing, as you know, and as you talk about in the book. So I thought that's a little bit of, just my story in this space. It took you 15 years to write this book, Matt. So I assume if I talked to you 15 years ago, it's an idea that you've had writing this book for a long time because you've written a lot of books. But as you went and worked so hard to get to primary, I think we call, I'm not a historian, but the primary sources like President Kimball's journal that Edward Kimball, his son, gave you access to. What surprised you the most the 15 years through this project?
What surprised me, I think, was reading not just President Kimball's diaries, but the other brethrens, Joseph Fielding Smith and others, their memos, their letters, their meeting minutes, especially their meeting minutes from the first presidency and the Quorum of the 12. And what surprised me, especially with President Kimball's diaries, was how they were affected by this ban that they had inherited. We like to think that somehow there's this, abstract ban in place but it affects real people. And just for your listening audience, I want to remind something that they all know, which is it wasn't just a priesthood ban, it was a temple ban. They couldn't go to the temple. They couldn't speak in stake and ward conferences, although some did. They weren't supposed to, but they did. They couldn't count tithes. They can't serve in any pastoral capacity. Women couldn't serve in the Relief Society. And they were the only racial minority designated for these exclusions. So it was much deeper than just the priesthood. And when then Elder Kimball in the 1950s and 60s, before he was the church president, part of his apostolic responsibilities was in South America. And I was just really struck reading his diaries when he went to a stake conference. And then afterwards, these Black and biracial Brazilians, for example, would come up to him and they would say, Elder Kimball, teenage boy, Elder Kimball, I want to serve a mission. I'm dying to serve the Lord on a mission, but I can't. Another older man would come up and he would say, Elder Kimball, I pay my tithing. I go to church every week. All I want to do is to be sealed to my wife in the temple. And he goes home that night in his hotel room and he writes that this is just having this profound visceral effect on him. So he sees the hurt and the harm that this ban is doing to these good people who just want to be faithful Latter-day Saints. And so Elder Kimball, as early as the 1950s, is questioning the doctrinal scaffolding for the ban. I mean, I've seen his scriptures from 1953, and let me tell you that story real quick. This is a funny one, or an interesting one, I think.
Good.
I was in a used bookstore, Moon's Used Books in, I think, Provo, Utah. And I had heard about Reed Moon, the owner, and he told me that he had Elder Kimball's scriptures and some other things. He said, Matt, next time you're in town, my in-laws live in Provo, not far from BYU. And he said, next time you're in town, come by and stop by the shop and I'll show you Elder Kimball's scriptures and some other things. I said, oh, that's great. So I went to his store and he brought out Elder Kimball's scriptures from 1953. So at this point, Elder Kimball would have been a member of the Quorum of the 12 by 9 years. He was called in 1943. And so about 10 years, I guess. So, but the scriptures was amazing because like any attentive author or reader, I should say, Elder Kimball wrote with a red marker, highlighting pencil, I guess. And then he would circle like skins of blackness in the Book of Mormon, and he would put in the margins Negro question mark.
Wow.
He's questioning this. He doesn't necessarily agree with this. And so you can see the discomfort early on, at least as early as the 50s. And then by 1963, he writes his son Edward a letter, and he says that, quote, the priesthood ban may have been a possible error.
Wow.
That was 63. And then in 69, he agrees to lift the ban with Hugh B. Brown, a man that he greatly admired. And he had to back off of that position, as my book talks about, when some of the other brethren got word of what President Brown was doing and they scuttled it. But the point is that President Kimball wanted to lift the ban the minute he became the church president. He was profoundly uncomfortable with it. And reading his diaries, Richard, just showed me how uneasy all of this was for him. And that's just one example that I can give. But I can even tell you, with Joseph Fielding Smith, the church's most, hardline apostle on the ban, reading his diaries and his private papers even illustrates that he felt uncomfortable with it. And it's let me give you one example with him. I think this is an amazing story. For your readers who may not know him that well, he was called into the Quorum of the 12 in 1910, and he would die in 1970. So he's a general authority for most of his adult life. He becomes the church's most prolific doctrinal authority. He writes dozens of books, including Doctrines of Salvation, Answers to Gospel Questions. The brethren look to him as sort of the expert. He comes from Mormon royalty. His father was the church president. His grandfather was Hiram Smith. So he's got brothers in the Quorum of the 12. So he's really deeply ensconced in church leadership. And Joseph Fielding Smith grew up in the Salt Lake, Utah Valley territory before it was a state, and he didn't know any Black people. And so most of his views about Black people derived from his own church and also from the broader 20th century culture. So he had these hardline views on race, and most people who see him and read his books, they just see this, this Old Testament sort of Puritan preacher, just hellfire and damnation. The truth is he had a sense of humor if you read his private papers, which is something. But he went to a priesthood meeting one time, and before the meeting began, this former mission president, a guy named Edgar Lyon, who was a teacher at the University of Utah Institute of Religion, and Edgar Lyon had served as a mission president in Norway in the late 40s, early 50s. And this priesthood meeting took place in 1953. And one of President Lyon's people that he knew from his mission was a young Norwegian man. And this young Norwegian man, President Lyon knew the family really well. So this young Norwegian man, about 23 years old, was scheduled to be married in the temple. And a couple of weeks before his temple sealing in Salt Lake, he learned from one of his relatives that they had a cursed ancestry, that one of his relatives derived from sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, this young man knows what it means. And he just has this, paralytic moment where he recognizes that his whole world will come tumbling down if he divulges this secret. And so he told President Lyon about it. And he said, President Lyon, this won't just affect me. This will affect my brother, who's a stake president.
Wow.
It'll affect my other brother, who's a bishop. And it'll affect my other brother, who's on the High Council. What do I do? So President Lyon said, I'm going to a meeting with Joseph Fielding Smith, who at this point in time was the president of the Quorum of the 12. He said, I'm going to go to a meeting and I'll run it by him. So at the beginning of this priesthood meeting, President Lyon talked to President Smith, and he said, I've got this young man that was in my mission, and this is the situation, and what do we do? And President Smith, without batting an eye, he said, well, what do you mean, what do we do? You know that the teachings of the church. He needs to share this with his bishop and stake president, which is a nice way of saying there won't be any temple marriage. So President Lyon is very liberal. He was discouraged by this response, but probably not surprised. So he sat down and they had the meeting. And then when the priesthood meeting ended, President Smith called up President Lyon, just motioned him up to come to the podium. And he said, during the meeting, I had this moment where we shouldn't tell this young man not to tell anybody.
Wow.
Because if you do, it'll trigger a release of his three brothers from their callings, and it will ruin this young man. And we'll let the Lord figure this out. That's kind of his attitude. We'll let the Lord figure it out, but don't tell anybody, including his bishop. And when I wrote that story in my book, my editor, who's not LDS, but by this point in the book, he got a full sense of Joseph Fielding Smith's racism. And he wrote plot twist in all caps, exclamation point. And that's really interesting because it is a plot twist. It's a version of Joseph Fielding Smith that we don't typically get. But when you see their private papers, you learn that they're human. They have feelings. And Joseph Fielding Smith and Spencer Kimball's papers reveal that abundantly.
Wow. The listeners, we'll never get to all these stories in the podcast. The purpose of the podcast is to get you to read the whole book because there's just stories after stories like this. And I was writing in the margins frequently. Listeners, I still remember listening to the radio, driving through Granger, Utah at age 17. That's now called West Valley. Hearing on the news on my way to work, I pulled over and I was happy. I don't think I'd given it much thought beforehand. I was aware it was a discussion topic in the church, but I probably was interested more in the ABA basketball team that played in Salt Lake with Zelmo Beatty and Willie Wise and Ron Boone, and some of you old timers will know those names. I just assumed it kind of drastically happened as a one-time revelation in the temple, kind of by accident, maybe during a prayer, and this happened. And then I realized, after learning more about this space in your book, that this happened over a lot of years. And even to your point, you just shared the 1950s with President Kimball's journal. Do you want to share more about that, Matt? The actual event that we talk about, that Priesthood Revelation, I think on June 1st, was the end cap of decades of work by people like Hugh B. Brown and many others.
Yeah, Hugh B. Brown and other members of the 12, the Brethren, they've all talked about what revelation means. And I think we're taught to think in the church that, I don't know, I know we're taught to think this, not that I think that we're taught this, but we're taught to think that revelation in the church is sort of a passive moment where you're just lying on your bed and God's speaking to you much as you would on a phone. That's not how institutional revelation works. That may be how personal revelation works, I guess, if you feel like God's speaking to you through the still small voice or planting thoughts in your mind. But institutional revelation, which is the kind of revelation that Doctrine and Covenants talks about with the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency, it's that they have to talk about it first and debate it and discuss it. And as Hugh Brown once put it, thrash it out. And then they vote. And then once they vote successfully or unanimously, then the president then stands and he says, I feel to say that this is a revelation. And of course, there's prayer involved in this, but it's a collective experience and it's a very active experience. It's not passive. And the passive part may be, that the church president feels like, oh, I've got to do something. But if anyone listening on this podcast thinks that, God just tells the president who just waves his wand to the 12 and the 12 fall in line, that is so not how it works. The brethren have different views. They have different life's experiences. They have different things they lobby for. Sometimes they really invested a lot of political capital on some doctrine or policy. Other times they stand back if they know they're outvoted. This is how it's done. And that's just the truth. And so President Kimball was a student of history. He knew what happened with Wilford Woodruff back in 1896 or 1890, I guess, when the first manifesto was issued by President Woodruff. He didn't get the full buy-in of the Quorum of the 12. And so it creates a schism in the church. Ultimately, some of the apostles will be excommunicated because they refuse to accept his revelation. They argue that God's laws are more important than any positive or man-made law. And so they refuse to support President Woodruff's revelation. You'll see this again in the 1960s with President McKay, that he doesn't always get buy-in from the 12. He'll make decisions that they think that they should be consulted on, but they're not. And so President Kimball recognizes all of this, and he knows that if he's going to lift this ban, that he's going to need the buy-in from the two top quorums of the church, the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. And so the question I'm often asked is, if he wanted to do this the minute he became the president, then why did it take him 5 years into his presidency to do it? And the answer is because he had to get the brethren on board. It took a long time. Some of these men have deep, deep rooted views on race. And President Kimball, being the shrewd and effective leader that he was, he recognized that he couldn't lift the ban unless he had the church's foremost theologian on board first, and that was Elder McConkie. And so my book talk about a plot twist, right?
Yeah.
McConkie, if you read Mormon Doctrine, that was published in 1958, and then it was a second printing in 1966, and then a third in 1979. But if you look at his views on Black people, he parrots back his father-in-law, Joseph Fielding Smith. So Elder McConkie had some very strong views on race, and the fact that President Kimball targets him first to win him over is extraordinary. And what he does is he tells Elder McConkie, he called him into his office one day and he said, Bruce, we've got a new temple that President Lee, Harold Lee, so Kimball's predecessor, he had announced that we would build a new temple in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And he said to Elder McConkie, he said, but you know that most of this country is multiracial. They bear the blood. And that's a euphemism for they have African ancestry. So they can't go to the temple. And President Kimball says to Elder McConkie, what should we do? And I mean, it's such a great question because President Kimball knows what needs to be done. But he's making Elder McConkie part of the solution, which is what an effective leader does. And so Elder McConkie came back to him and he said, President Kimball, I've got an idea. Let's lift the ban.
Wow.
Gee, Bruce, never thought of that. And so, but to Elder McConkie's, he recognizes that to move the church forward, this is what needs to be done. And I might add just one quick backdrop to this important story, which is that President Kimball gave this magnificent address to the regional representatives of the church in April of 1974, just after he was ordained the president. And this is the famous address that I grew up hearing. Richard, I'm sure you grew up hearing it. It spans 2 generations or more. And essentially the address is to the regional representatives and state presidents and others in the room. So it wasn't a general conference. It was a private meeting that ultimately got published in church magazines. But the address was, we've got to globalize the church. We've got to accelerate our efforts. Every member a missionary. We have to pray to get behind the Iron Curtain, to open up missions in red areas of the world, communist areas of the world. Missionaries need to be worthy. They need to save their money. They need to prepare spiritually, emotionally, financially, all of that. So he has this really incredible vision, and he calls in a government official who was always a loyal Latter-day Saint, a guy named David Kennedy, after which the Kennedy Center at BYU is named. He was the Secretary of Treasury in the Nixon administration, and he had just retired from Nixon's cabinet. And President Kimball didn't let him retire. He said, Brother Kennedy, I've got an assignment for you. Help us to get into places in the world that we can't get into, including sub-Saharan Africa. And Kennedy was just blunt with him. He said, you want to get into sub-Saharan Africa, President Kimball, don't bother. They need to run their own churches. You can't send white people from Salt Lake to run their churches. It won't work. And President Kimball's like, yeah, we tried that in Nigeria about a decade ago. It was a disaster. So what President Kimball didn't tell Kennedy, but I'm sure Kennedy was shrewd and perceptive, what he didn't tell him was, I'm going to lift the ban. I've already decided this. What I need you to do is to help work and get our missionaries in places that they have been shut off to go. So that's his great vision. And President Kimball's not dumb. He recognizes that in order to advance this globalist vision, he has to get rid of this odious ban. But he has some members of the 12 that are holding him up. And that's why it took him 5 years, because he has to get them to see the wisdom of it.
And listeners, it's just fascinating to listen to Matt. I'm reliving my childhood, and it's just, I'm looking at David O. McKay that died in 1970. I was 9 and remember that. And then it wasn't a surprise that Joseph Fielding Smith at about 93 became the president. He lived till 72 and died at 95. And then I remember Harold B. Lee becoming the prophet in his early 70s. Not sure we'll ever see that happen again in the church. I remember my parents just saying, he will serve for 20 years. And then, he died in 1 year and 5 months. And then President Kimball, who always wanted to lift the ban, became the prophet. I would love this, I'm sure the shock of that, I bet he never thought he'd be president of the church. I think he's roughly 20 years older than Harold B. Lee. But he's always, and Harold B. Lee, from what you've said in the book, was not supportive of lifting the ban. So it's just an interesting backstory in what you're sharing with us. And I don't know if you want to comment on that. We lost 3 prophets in 3 years, and then President Kimball left for 12 years.
Yeah. So, President McKay was the prophet that everybody knew and loved and admired in the post-World War II generation. He was the prophet from 1951 to 1970. And so next in line was Joseph Fielding Smith, who was just a couple of years younger than President McKay. And then the third person in line was Harold Lee. And so everybody thought, or at least most people who paid attention to these things in the 60s, they thought that President Smith would be the prophet, but not for very long, because frankly, he was old. He was sleeping through a lot of his meetings. People talk about this in their private, went to a meeting today. President Smith is in the corner sleeping. And they breathed a huge sigh of relief when he gave his first general conference talk. They thought he was going to fall over. And so he wasn't expected to be the president very long. And so Harold Lee was supposed to be David O. McKay Part 2. They thought that he would, because he was in his early 70s, that he would stay on for 20 plus years, just like President McKay. Obviously, that didn't happen. And one of the Lee's descendants told me that my grandfather ate too many cheeseburgers. And he had some heart issues. But anyway, he didn't stay on very long. And President Kimball, Richard, as you alluded to, had a host of health issues himself. He had throat cancer. He had a heart attack a few years earlier. And President Kimball, he's not a really red, domineering personality, not one of these, CEO corporate types who goes around giving speeches, grabbing his lapels and using these powerful hands. He didn't do any of that stuff. He is a mild-mannered guy, and he thought that he would be a caretaker president. At least he commented on that one time. I'm not going to do anything. Who am I to change what my predecessors have done? But in more serious moments and more reflective moments, he recognized that he had a unique opportunity to move the church forward. And with this globalist vision that had really begun by President McKay, and it was really accelerated with President Kimball. But President Kimball, let me say 2 other things about him. He also recognized that the church had been ordaining biracial men to the priesthood all the time. They know this. They talk about this in their meetings. You can't just look at someone and say, they bear the curse. That's just not how it works. And so they know they're doing this. They know it's embarrassing, especially if you find some effective branch president or bishop who's serving his ward or branch community really well. And then all of a sudden, it's disclosed that he's got an ancestor from sub-Saharan Africa. And then they have to either they tell him to stay his hand, which means that you can't practice your priesthood in public anymore. You can't serve as bishop or branch president, but you can give blessings to your children, which has always been baffling to me. Or sometimes it would come to their attention, and the branch president would say, "Hey, I just found out about my ancestry," and and I'm thinking of Howard W. Hunter on one occasion. He said, "Don't tell anybody. I didn't hear this." Puts his fingers in his ears. Carry on, brother. So that's going on a lot. And also with President Kimball, he is sick and tired of being asked about the ban everywhere he goes. Mm. And church members, I've had several people quote this at me. Well, not several, but some have quoted this at me. Well, did you see what he said in 1974? He said that he would defend the ban to the day he died. And I'm thinking, of course, that's what he's saying publicly. What do you think he's going to say? I've got bigots in the quorum. I got to work with the bigots. I'm not going to say that. So anyway, he says the public relations line, right? But in private, he's really, really praying, and he's going to the temple, and he's not praying, dear God, should I lift the ban? Is it the right thing to do? He knows that the ban has to go. What he's really praying for is, help me to get the brethren to see the wisdom of it.
Wow.
That is a massive, massive difference in the way that he phrases his prayer.
Wow.
Keep in mind what I said earlier in this podcast, which is in 1953, he's already questioning the doctrinal underpinnings of the ban. He doesn't think that some of these racialized verses in the Book of Mormon refer to Black people. He tells his son in 1963 the ban may have been a possible error. In the fall of 1969, he agrees with Hugh Brown to ordain a Black man to the priesthood. So he's not asking God, should I lift this? He's been told by David Kennedy, you've got to lift the ban if you want to globalize the church. So he sees this, and that's a huge difference that I think, Richard, some church members don't understand. This is not June 1st where he shows up one day like maybe you and I and the rest of us have heard. It was a very passive thing, right? Let's just pray, and all of a sudden God gives them all this inspiration. That's not how it happened. And in fact, just one couple pieces of evidence to that, if what I've said isn't enough, couple pieces is that in March of 1978, President Kimball was full blown ahead to lift the ban. He didn't have the support of the brethren. Mark Peterson, Elder Peterson didn't support it. Elder Benson didn't support it. Elder Stapley didn't support it. And at that point, Elder McConkie was already on board, and some others were as well, including his counselors, Marion Romney and Nathan Tanner. But he didn't have the full support of the brethren in March of 78 when he wanted to lift it. And then in May of 78, President Kimball writes out a revelation. Now, this is May. We haven't even lifted it yet. So he writes it out in May, talking about, lifting of the ban and all of this. And so when June 1st came around, President Kimball, this is why I think he's a genius, he recognized that he couldn't win over Elder Peterson. So Elder Peterson was sent to Ecuador on a church assignment. Elder Stapley went into the hospital, and he would die 2 months later in August. That left one person that day who was the holdup, and that was Elder Benson, who was not insignificant. Elder Benson was next in line to be the church president. And when they had their Thursday morning meeting in the temple, which is what they normally do, President Kimball very politely and humbly said afterwards, brethren, can we forego lunch and talk? There's something I want to talk to you about. Now, they all know what's on his mind because he's been talking to them for the previous 3 months. And collectively, he's been talking to them. He's been talking to others individually for at least a year, 2, 3 years by that point. But anyway, brother, can you stay around? And we want to talk about something. And he brings it up. He says, I want to talk about the priesthood ban. And Elder Benson raises his hand and says, let's table this discussion. And President Kimball says, no, we're going to talk about it today, which is a nice way of saying we're going to lift this thing today. And so to Elder Kimball or Elder Benson's, to his credit, I'm going to speculate for a minute, he probably felt ganged up on, Elder McConkie spoke for 10 minutes, and I have it in my mind's eye, I can't prove this, but I have in my mind's eye that when Elder McConkie was speaking to the brethren about the wisdom of lifting the ban, a position which he came around to 2 years earlier, I have in my mind's eye that he's going to Elder Benson, come on, Ezra, you can do this. And anyway, but to Elder Benson's credit, he does change his mind, and he writes in his diary that this was a glorious moment. There was a great spirit of unity with the brethren on June 1st, and he felt it. And I'm going to give him all the benefit of the doubt that he felt that this is the right thing to do, that he had a change of heart. It wasn't just that he was accepting of the dominant majority, but he actually had a change of heart, that this was the right thing to do. That's me being generous, possibly. Elder Benson, some strong views on race. And then anyway, later on that day, they called Elder Peterson in Ecuador, and President Kimball, calls him up and says, Mark, we met today and we lifted the ban. You did what, President? Yeah, we lifted the ban. And the first thing he says is, did everybody agree to it? Yeah, everybody agreed to it. Well, I suppose I won't stand in the way. That's hardly a ringing endorsement. And the same thing with Elder Stapley. The First Presidency visited Elder Stapley in his hospital room in Salt Lake, and he agreed to do it as well. But President Kimball was known to do this. I've interviewed a few people, including a general authority who was, I didn't interview the general authority. I have the oral history, I should say, of somebody who interviewed the general authority. And this general authority in this oral history said that President Kimball was known to send away on church assignments people who didn't agree to some policy or doctrinal change. He would just simply remove them. And he would make sure that he had a quorum that was left behind in Salt Lake. And then they would tell the apostle after the fact, this is what we did in your absence. And if you ask me, that's It's a stroke of genius because it's a way to get things done when you can't get all 15 on board.
It's just fascinating to understand that. And um, I want to get, listeners, I read this through the eyes of an LGBTQ ally. So I want to talk a little bit about that. But, I just want to ask some questions before I get there. So if you want to hear that content, stay tuned, listeners. Don't give up. I've sort of, maybe I'm this way. Why do some Latter-day Saints feel it's easier that God is a racist or had a racist policy than Brigham Young?
I think, we're taught in the church that we say that the brethren are infallible. Or they're not infallible, excuse me. We say that they're not infallible, but then you talk about their infallibility. Nobody wants to talk about it. The brethren make mistakes. Well, I don't want to hear their mistakes. And the truth is, I don't think that that's effective because people don't relate to people like that. And Richard, we don't want to pin any problems on church presidents, including the band. We'd rather pin it on God. And somehow it's easier to digest if we say that God is the responsible for this ban because, of course, who are we to question God and his timetable and his wisdom? And that's not helpful for a lot of reasons, not least Black and biracial Latter-day Saints, at least the dozens and dozens and dozens that I know and associate with and been to conferences with. I mean, they are repulsed by that statement. Their God is not racist.
Good.
And neither is my God.
Agreed.
And so when people pin the ban on God, it's not good. Sometimes when well-intentioned Latter-day Saints will give a sermon and, a talk in their ward or state conference, and they invoke the Old Testament or biblical line that God privileged certain people back in biblical days for the priesthood, the Jews and the Gentiles. When they invoke that line and apply it to the ban, what they're really saying is God's responsible for the ban. And so a lot of Black people that I know, they get angry when they hear that people are appealing to the Bible to justify the ban. I think the more, the wiser course to pursue is to own up to the racism. Brigham Young lived at a time when 4 million Africans were enslaved. He was part of this culture where Black people were subordinate to every other group of people. It is not a stretch of the imagination to argue that he instituted this racial ban because of his own racial proclivities. And I might add just a little footnote here for a moment. There were some of the early priesthood brethren who were biracial, and they were Black men, one Black man, one biracial man. They were priesthood holders, and they were marrying white women polygamously. And Brigham Young didn't like that. Polygamy was largely reserved for white people. So anyway, you can draw a straight line, pretty careful straight line between when he made those edicts against interracial polygamous marriages to the priesthood ban in 1852. At least 1852 is when it became publicized. You mentioned Paul Reeve. He's argued that the ban may have occurred a little bit earlier, but it wasn't really publicized until 1852. But the point is that Brigham Young is responsible for the ban, and the church hasn't really owned up to that. They don't want to pin the ban on Brother Brigham because he's a church president. But my position is all the evidence points to Brigham Young. And my position is also that people are forgiving. That if we contextualize President Young and talk about the day that he lived, then I think people can accept that. But to sort of say it's God, I mean, that's where it keeps the story alive. And I don't think that's healthy.
Great answer. And I love the way you answered it through the lens of Black Latter-day Saints and how painful that is for them to believe in a racist God. It tugged at my heartstrings, Matt. Some say the ban, certainly in my lifetime, I've heard this over and over again, the ban was just policy. It was something that was never doctrine. Our doctrine never changes. The policy can change. Talk about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I'm a little frustrated. Elder Packer, the late Elder Packer, I mean, he was a big proponent of that. Doctrines don't change, but policies do. And he's not alone in that. Some of the other brethren have taught that. But a number of the brethren didn't teach that doctrines do change. And anyone who studies church history in theology knows that doctrines have changed. I mean, my goodness, the 21st century church today is so radically different in not just culture, of course, but our doctrinal beliefs and teachings. So different from the 20th century and especially the 19th century. So to claim that doctrines don't change, I mean, that's not helpful. And especially when you look at how people understood various teachings over time, they accepted them as doctrine because it was taught to them as doctrine. So, for example, in the 19th century and into the 21st century, especially into the 20th century, the Mormon racial teachings become codified by 1947 or 1949 in a first presidency statement. They call it doctrine that had always existed since the foundation of the church. That's a first presidency statement. And I had just to pause the story for a moment, I was at a conference years ago, and somebody from, I think, the church's correlation team came up to me after a paper I gave, and he said, you call it doctrine. Can you help us with this? And I said, well, I'm calling it doctrine because the first presidency called it doctrine in 1949. And I believe him. So, I said, and I kind of, I told him what I thought. I said, it's not helpful for you to call it a policy when the first presidency called it a doctrine. It's not helpful to call it a policy when the church's most senior apostle back in the day wrote a book called Doctrines of Salvation with the band as part of the book. Or another general authority wrote a book called Mormon Doctrine, right? So, they're calling it doctrine everywhere. And you see this. And this whole idea of this policy thing is just a way to make it palatable to the masses, that our doctrines don't change, but policies can change. Not helpful. And I always tell people the beauty of the church is its belief in modern day revelation. And so what? It was a doctrine back in the day. That doesn't mean that President Nelson can't change a new doctrine. That's the beauty of modern day revelation, that you're not beholden to the doctrines or policies of your predecessors. You feel like that God is speaking anew, that the heavens are open, right? So this whole doctrinal thing that it never changes, it's immutable. I mean, I just don't think that's good theology. It doesn't square with the church's theology. But Elder Packer he taught that a lot. Doctrines don't change. But his colleagues in church leadership over the years didn't teach that. And you can probably any of your listeners can do a 5-minute search on the internet, and you'll find lots of different apostles who talk about doctrines changing. But Elder Packer was somehow, I'm not sure why he was so tied to that point. There was a BYU professor named Charles Harold, and he wrote a book it was published, I think, 2011. And it was about, it's a big book, and it's about all the doctrines that have changed in Mormonism over the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. I mean, it's an exhaustive book about how things they were taught as doctrine by church presidents and how these things have evolved over time. And so, anyway, the whole policy with the band thing, it was a public relations line. It's a policy, But as I point out in my book, it's not a defensible policy because so many of the brethren characterize it as doctrine. And even in the brethren's private letters, not just these first presidency statements, but in their private letters, they're calling it the Negro Doctrine. And that's the word they use in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So the 21st century, they're calling it a policy. They're saying, we don't know why the band existed. Those are just public relations lines to get the, critics off their backs.
I'm with you on that. I certainly, the way I frame it up, listeners, is there's these eternal truths that don't change, like we're all alike unto God, and our doctrine is our best attempt to reflect those eternal truths that, like Matt is sharing with us, have changed and may continue to change. And that, I'm looking for models for those of you that are sort of in faith transitions or faith crisis, trying to stay in the church. And I think that's more sustainable, that model, than saying doctrine never changes and then recognizing, hey, it really has. And so I just think gaslighting is a term that's been introduced to me recently by really thoughtful people. When I say it's just a policy, or I think that minimizes what you just shared with us and is unhelpful. I've heard some people say, Matt, well, it just wasn't time for the ban to be lifted, with sort of the assumption God didn't want it lifted, that he wasn't ready to have it lifted. And that's back to the assumption he started in the first place and it just wasn't time to lift it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that puts it right back in God's lap. And I mean, I don't agree with that. And I, it would have been suspicious, I suppose, if the Brethren lifted the ban in the 1950s or 60s. I mean, President McKay wanted to lift the ban. Let's be clear. My book talks about this. He even assembled a committee of apostles to look into the doctrinal justifications for the ban, and the report made up of, I might add, liberal apostles, because Joseph Fielding Smith would not have been on this committee. President McKay would have stacked the deck, I'm sure. But anyway, they concluded in 1954 that the ban didn't have any doctrinal support, and nor could they find a revelation from Joseph Smith. And so McKay thought it was a policy himself, but it was a policy that required unanimity vis-a-vis revelation to lift and overturn. And so with President Kimball in the 70s, and the time wasn't right. I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of a silly line, right? Somehow people weren't ready in 1973, but by 78 they were ready. I mean, that's just not sustainable. The truth is, there's not a lot that's changing from 73 to say 78 in terms of attitudes. We'll see attitudinal changes through the civil rights era a little bit, I think. But the truth is that there's a lot going on, not just with President Kimball recognizing that he needs to globalize the church, not just recognizing that they're already ordaining Black and biracial men to the priesthood unwittingly, not just that they're tired of being asked everywhere they go, including the Washington, D.C. temple dedication in 1974. The first thing the press wants to do is, when do you lift the ban? And all they want to talk about is this beautiful temple they just built, a temple that I had the privilege of attending as a youth, driving from Maine on a big chartered bus with the youth and going to do these baptisms for the dead in the DC temple. Anyway, so they're tired of all the PR line. It's really obstructing the church's larger message of salvation. And anyway, so there's a lot of things going on. The IRS is cracking down on institutions that discriminate, and I've been asked about that before. Was the IRS behind his revelation? I'm like, no, it wasn't. Because that presupposes the IRS made him do it. And the truth is, he wanted to do it all along. But the IRS is in the background. I mean, they're aware of this. They're following what the IRS is doing. So it's not sustainable. President Kimball knows this. And to suggest that somehow people are ready for it in 1978, that's just remiss. And one of the things that President Kimball is concerned about, however, is that he talks about this with some of his associates. He says, look, if we lift this ban, what will it do to the church in the South? I mean, they are mindful of the church. And in 1963, Henry Moyle of the First Presidency, he wrote a Mormon bishop in Salt Lake, and he said, when we have a doctrine or a policy that elicits a wave of pushback, it forces us to rethink our position. Mm. And I mean, that's the kind of practicality that you see behind the scenes. And so President Kimball's very well aware of what the ban could do in the South. And of course, when they lifted the ban in 1978, there's no way to quantify the number of saints that supported this or didn't support it. We know that some of the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, they wrote him President Kimball, some nasty letters. They were already out of the church anyway with polygamy. There were some other members that wrote him some letters. One called him, pardon my language, but one called him a senile old bastard. How would you allow these people to come into our church? I mean, I was shocked when I read through the Kimball papers and I saw those angry letters. And you're a doddering old fool, another letter said. These are from Latter-day Saints. But I'm of the persuasion, from all the years of study that I've done on this, I'm of the persuasion that most Latter-day Saints, accepted the lifting of the ban. That was the easy part. President Kimball had a revelation. I accept him as a prophet. I accept the ban. That's the easy part. The harder part is welcoming Black and biracial people into your faith communities. And that's where you run into trouble. Because when they lifted the ban in 1978, they did not disavow the doctrine that had fueled the ban. And so what you have in the 1980s and into the 1990s and into the 21st century, frankly, you get well-intentioned Latter-day Saints, white Latter-day Saints, telling Black Latter-day Saints, hey, look, brother, God lifted that curse in 1978. You're good. And of course, this Black brother would say, you don't get it. I don't believe that I've ever been cursed. And so the Latter-day Saints telling the Black community that, they don't realize how offensive that is. And they just think that they're towing the church line because President Kimball never, ever dealt with that doctrine directly. And I might add that it wasn't repudiated, the curse of Cain and the preexistence theology. It wasn't repudiated until 2013 when the church posted a race and priesthood document on its webpage.
That is a big part of the book, listeners. I encourage you to read. Is I thought everything was hunky-dory, an official word, in 1978, and I had no clue about how much pain existed for Black Latter-day Saints. And that's really helpful. I think as you read the book, you'll hear more about the apostles. And a hypothesis I had, two questions. My great-grandfather is LeGrand Richards, and he's in this mix. And my mother will be listening to this podcast. She's 92, and her grandson. And I'm curious, you wrote about him a little bit, so I'd love to just hear anything about LeGrand Richards in the mix of this. It doesn't sound like he was strongly in one way or the other, but another question in that question is, do you feel like those that had proximity to Black Latter-day Saints was a link between those that were more supportive and those that never had those sort of firsthand or experiences? Any thoughts on both of those?
Oh, no question, Richard. First of all, hi to Sister Osler, your mother.
Thank
nice
you.
to meet you. Yeah, there's no question that familiarity breeds compassion in this case. I'll give you one example. That I mentioned one of the apostles who comes around first to being more supportive of President Kimball and lifting the ban. That's Elder McConkie, and told you about how that happened with President Kimball going to Elder McConkie with a problem. We've got this temple that we're building. How do we do this? These faithful Latter-day Saints can't enjoy the privileges of the temple because they bear the curse, as they put it. But the other people who came to his President Kimball's support or his side first was Boyd Packer, Gordon Hinckley, and Tom Monson. And I know that's hard for some people to hear. Monson and Hinckley are more moderate in their views and their theology and in their politics. And Elder Packer, of course, is more conservative. But Elder Packer and Elder Monson and Elder Hinckley, they were the apostolic advisors to the Genesis group. This is an early Black support group. There's still one today. Actually, there's more than one, but the main one is in Salt Lake. And it started in the early 70s because of three Black men, Darius Gray, a friend of mine, Ruffin Bridgeforth, and a man named Gene Orr. And they wanted the priesthood. They wanted more equality in the church. And so they wanted to meet with Joseph Fielding Smith, and he kept putting them off. And, he kind of had this sense that, they're up to no good. They're going to badger me for the priesthood. And he's in his 90s at this point. He doesn't want to be badgered. So anyway, they were persistent. Give it to them. They were persistent. And finally, Joseph Fielding Smith and his lieutenant, his counselor, Harold Lee, was essentially the one running the church because President Smith's frail age or frail health. Lee was running the church as the counselor. And they appointed an apostolic committee of Monson, Hinckley, Packer to meet with these three Black men. And so, without going into the details, because my book does this in a lot of detail, but they realize, these three apostles, that Black people will never fully be comfortable in the church unless they have the priesthood. You can tell them all you want. Hey, don't worry. You can get baptized. You can have a patriarchal blessing. You can do this. You can do that. We do more for you than any other church. But you can't have the priesthood. You can't go to the temple. And, some of these Black people they push back. And they argue stuff like, what about Elijah Abel? Didn't he hold the priesthood at one point, a biracial man in the early days of the church? What about him? How do you deal with that? And Eugene Orr, Black man, turned to President Elder Hinckley and he said, you've been telling me that I'm less valiant in the preexistence. How come Black people don't know this? And another aside, another Black man named Monroe Fleming, he would go to President Smith And he would say, tell me why Black people can't hold the priesthood. And President Smith would give him this 20-minute oration on, the scriptures of Abraham 2 and the preexistence and less valiant and all that stuff. And after patiently listening for 20 minutes, Monroe Fleming would then say to President Smith, now tell me why again we can't have the priesthood? I mean, he doesn't believe in any of this stuff. So anyway, these three apostles, they recognize up close and personal how the ban is really causing dissension in the church. And ultimately, many of the early members of the Genesis group will leave the church. Some will come back, like Darius Gray, but others will leave for good. And so it was easy for them to understand President Kimball's vision because they had these personal experiences with these Black members themselves. And I think that that's really, really critical to any story when we're dealing with marginalized groups. Usually when you're dealing with immigrants or LGBTQ or anybody, and you know them personally, then you're more likely to reject the extreme rhetoric that you may hear about them if you have a relationship with them.
And LeGrand Richards, it sounds like he was just kind of in the middle ground. Is that your impression?
Yeah, LeGrand Richards, he's an interesting character.
I think he's the oldest of the bunch.
He is the oldest. And let me say one story about LeGrand Richards that I think is a great story. A couple things about LeGrand Richards. So LeGrand Richards is sensitive to this whole idea of cursed lineages. And in 1973, LeGrand Richards is one of three apostles who attended a meeting during General Conference weekend where the church patriarchs, when they were coming into the conference, and they wanted to meet with the brethren, which is what they typically do, and they asked questions of the brethren, in this case, three apostles. And the patriarchs asked questions about their assignments and their responsibilities. And this is 1973. So one of the things that always was on their mind was, how do we declare lineage on a Black or biracial person? Do we tell them that they bear the curse of Cain? And should we do that? Because blessings are supposed to, there's a couple of purposes for patriarchal blessings. One would be to declare lineage. And the other one would be to give you a roadmap for your life, to give you comfort and direction and guidance. And if you're declaring a cursed lineage on a Black or biracial person, it's not going to make them feel good. LeGrand Richards, when it was asked at this patriarch meeting by one of the patriarchs about declaring lineage, he said, if I feel inspired to declare the curse of Cain on somebody, shouldn't I do that? And LeGrand Richards was pretty frank. He said, no, you shouldn't do that. It won't make them feel good. So I thought that was interesting. And the other one story is that in May of 1978, so a month before President Kimball lifted the ban, they were in a meeting and Elder Richards was in the temple. And he talked about when he was a young boy seeing Wilford Woodruff. And I'm certain that you, Richard, and maybe your mother and your relatives know this story because it's been talked about. But he talked about, seeing Wilford Woodruff. And I'm going to summarize or paraphrase the story. But he told the brethren during their Thursday morning meeting in the temple, he said that I almost feel like all the church presidents, starting with the one that I knew, Wilford Woodruff, as a boy, that they're all giving approval that this is what God wants us to do, which is to lift the ban.
Wow.
And he says that he has a vision. He tells the brethren about a vision that he has when he's in the temple that day, that he sees Wilford Woodruff and some of the other church presidents. And as I write in my book, I'm trying to really make sense of this vision. What does it mean to him? And more importantly, how does this vision affect the brethren, some of whom are still holding out on lifting the ban? And so, but President Kimball gave Elder Richards the space to talk about this vision, and he did. And that was, I think, in my view, a contribution to this discussion that doesn't often get recognized.
Thank you for that. Just a couple comments, listeners. I'm looking at the painting from Anthony Sweat in my room across of Walker Lewis, who you would know was a Black man ordained before the ban. I've had that painting for a long time, and it's just white hands on a Black man sitting there getting the priesthood before the ban. And Walker, I believe, left the church. This is just a really complicated space. I'd like to talk a little bit about, here's what I wrote. I wrote this down. I'm an LGBTQ ally and looking to better support LGBTQ Latter-day Saints. As I read your book, I wondered if a similar removal of the ban will ever happen to LG Latter-day Saints regarding same-sex marriage? Would that be false hope? Other thoughts on this topic? And just hold that in your mind. I want to share one quick story about LeGrand Richards before we completely move on. Is I'm in my 20s and he's in his 90s, and we go visit him in the hospital, and I think he's going to die, and so it might be our last visit. And we visit him in the hospital, and he's very much alive, but we know ahead of time he's had his leg amputated from the knee down. And we walk into the hospital room, he says, "Better die from the bottom up than the top down." And it's just an insight into his personality and the optimism. So, but I think you can remember my question on that sidetrack, so I'll just let you run with the question, Matt.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's false hope. The church is going to allow the LBGT community the full recognition that they deserve. I don't think it'll be in my lifetime, but it's going to happen. And a couple of markers about this theologically can happen because, once again, this is the beauty of modern day revelation. And it takes, of course, the church president to be active on this, to broach it with the 12, to talk about it, to debate it, to thrash it out, as Hugh Brown once said. So that's the beauty of modern day revelation. But a couple of things to look at about the likelihood of this happening. One would be that when other churches start to allow, some have already done it, of course, but when there's a majority of Christian denominations in the United States that allow it, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints will not be on an island to themselves, holding out. It won't happen. It couldn't happen with civil rights. I've often said that if you wanted to know the band would end, it was the 60s that did it. And anyway, so it will happen, but look at other churches first. Secondly, look at the data that is coming out, not by the church. They don't release their data. They're very tight on this. But look at the data that my friend Jana Reese and others are producing. She's a social scientist. She's trained in religious history. And she's capturing the attitudes of LGBTQ in marriage and all of that in her surveys and other things that she writes. And what you're seeing is that a number of Latter-day Saint youth mirror attitudes of gay marriage like their peers nationally. If you can keep those people in the church, and that's a big if you can keep the youth in the church, they will be tomorrow's leaders. And I don't mean to be disrespectful when I say this, Richard, and to the rest of your audience, so please don't take it this way. But the youth today, they don't take their views on sexuality from the brethren, many of whom are in their 90s, their 80s and 90s. They just don't. And so, when you hear some sermon about that somehow gay people are flawed and all of that, it doesn't resonate with them because they're going to high school. And these kids, it's more normalized today. They look around in their high schools and they see, people holding hands, and it's not weird to them like it is, maybe 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. So they don't take their views on sexuality from our leaders. And if they stay in the church, they will be tomorrow's leaders. They will be tomorrow's general authorities. It will be those people who will initiate those important questions about, is it God's will to keep loving couples apart? And I know for a fact that there are some, I want to leave this just vague, if that's okay, but I know for a fact that there are some general authorities who support this. They just don't have the numbers. And I think with each passing year, I think people will be more, permissive.
Thank you for that. And I've shared this on the podcast before. I had a dream a year or two ago that I had passed away, and one of my grandkids made their way to my grave and said, "Grandpa, they finally found a place for gay people in the church." And that's a sad dream, Matt, because there's so much pain right now. I don't want to point to the future. I agree with what you said. I'm not an activist, listeners. I'm not saying what the church should do. I don't know God's will, but I'm very open to a change in doctrine policy because there's just so much pain. I wrote this down ahead of time so I can just read it to you. It seems that a major premise of the priesthood ban is lifting it would lead to bad outcomes around interracial marriage, some writers during Brigham Young's time even saying it would end the population, or we no longer be a white and some people, become communist or other fear-based stuff that you write about. That has all changed. As you know, we have mixed race marriages at all levels of the church, up to General Authority 70. Do you see a parallel with that assumption and our current assumption that being in a same-sex marriage leads to bad outcomes, like you can't be happy, you can't be good parents, your kids will suffer, population numbers were lower, we'll groom straight kids to be gay, a sign of the last days, God not happy? There's kind of a long list. Is that a good parallel to make, or is that not good thinking? Any thoughts on that?
No, I think I need to give a nuanced answer to that
Good.
because those fears that you mentioned with the ban, the race mixing will lead to communism, it'll lead to this, it'll lead to that. And the parallels with gay marriage, I mean, those are born out of right-wing extremist politics. And I think, and your listeners will know this if they follow the Brethren, most of the Brethren are not extremists.
Yeah.
They're just not, even though they have views that many of us would not, we wish they would be more inclusive with gay marriage, but they're not extremists politically. And so I don't see them making that argument at the top echelons of church leadership. I just don't. They oppose it for different reasons. Part of it would be just inertia. Are we the one to make this radical change? It's something that maybe President Kimball felt, right? Am I the one to do this, to uphold 126 years of prophetic tradition on the ban? So I think there might be some inertia. And also, they would look at the proclamation of the family that they've quasi-officially enshrined in the doctrine. How would that affect that? And I've already commented about that, right? That's the beauty of modern day revelation. You're not beholden to a document that you created back in the mid-90s to affirm to the world that you're going to oppose gay marriage efforts, which was becoming a thing back in the early 90s, starting in Hawaii, and then it spread. So that was the context to this proclamation. And I think doctrinally is the biggest holdup. I don't see, at least I haven't seen any rhetoric to lead me to believe that somehow it'll be damaging to children, because that's not what the literature shows on this. That somehow it'll make kids gay. I mean, these are right-wing talking points. I don't see the Brethren advancing those points. Maybe they hold them in private, but I've seen no evidence in public. Let me say a couple things about this that might be interesting. I mean, Elder Cook was a stake president in San Francisco for a number of years. He ministered weekly, daily to gay people. So there's no way on God's green earth he's going to take those right-wing extremist tropes. I don't believe it. I'm speculating. I haven't talked to Elder Cook, so I want to be clear. Elder Christofferson, his brother's been very high profile about living in the church as a gay man, and he's written some books by Desert Book, right? I don't believe that Elder Christofferson would believe that. Elder Gong has a son that's gay. So I'm not divulging anything, right? These things have been out in the public. Anyway, and I'm told that there are some other apostles that I don't know if it's public, so I don't want to comment further, but I know that there's a couple of other apostles who have gay grandkids. And President Oaks's grandson just came out recently in the Salt Lake Tribune, so that's public. But there's another couple I'm thinking of that I don't think they've come out, so I don't want to say anything. But, so they're not going to believe that. They're just really stuck in this doctrinal box. And it's going to take a very energetic church president to sort of get the church to think beyond the box, to broaden the tent. And I firmly believe this is going to happen. Don't know if it'll be in my lifetime, but it will happen. And I would say that it'll have to happen for the church to really flourish as we move further into the 21st century.
I just enjoyed reading your book through that lens, since that's a space I'm very much engaged in. My advice, if you're LGBTQ, writing your story is don't write it based, do you think the doctrine will change? You've got to, especially if you're a young person considering your path, I think you've got to write it with God, assuming that doctrine won't change, and just get on with your life. Don't focus on things you can't control. And if you're an ally, I think you need to focus on your circle of influence. If you're a general authority, that's a lot bigger than mine as a local lay member. So focus generally on your circle of influence, what you can influence. But we're kind of coming to the end. I don't know if you want to talk any more about LGBTQ in the lens of this book, or or if you want to go back to parts of the book that you loved readers to understand that we haven't covered, or just anything else you'd like to share with our listeners.
Well, I guess one along the lines of LGBTQ for a moment. That last weekend, I was at a big speaking event in California, and I met a gay man who's happily married to his husband, and he holds a pretty prominent calling in the church. And clearly, his bishop and stake president are enormously supportive, even though he's married. He loves the church. He's not an activist, by the way, but he loves the church and loves the teachings. And when I met him and heard a little bit about his story last weekend, I was so heartwarmed by all of this, simply because he gives a vision for how it can be. And I don't know if this man has had discussions with some of the general authorities, but I know that he's very tight with his stake president and bishop, and he's very open and transparent about who he is and how much he loves the gospel. But when I heard that, that was the first thing that popped into my head, that there's a roadmap here. And I think you saw that parallel with Black and biracial people. These are good people who love the church. And it's not my place to tell somebody on the margins, especially. It's not my place to say, stay in and fight it out, because you have to decide yourself you have to protect your mental health and do what God wants you to do. But I would say, though, that if you do stay in the church, that you find a community who loves you and accepts you for who you are. Hopefully you have a bishop, because it starts at that local level, that you have a bishop that just loves you and welcomes you. And maybe if you don't have that experience, maybe move to the next ward over. But in my experience, when people get to know who you are as stories, or your stories and your goodness, they're less likely to turn you away. And that's, when I think of Jesus and especially the New Testament, how inclusive Jesus was and how loving he was. And I'm hoping that the church can see that vision from gay Latter-day Saints who do make the effort to stay. I'll tell you one thing they don't respond to, the brethren, is, vitriol and anger. And I know those are normal, experiences and justifiable experiences, and especially. But to be effective about getting your story out, you have to focus on the church and focus on the goodness of the church and what it does for you. And I think that if the brethren can see what the gospel can do to gay people and other marginalized communities, immigrants, let's say, then you're more likely to get the changes that you desire, because I think at their very heart, they're torn by the gospel of inclusion, but also some of the policies that exclude. And this is just something that they continue to grapple with, and I'm hoping one day that they can break down those barriers.
I love proximity. I love that you were in California and are proximate to gay people participating in the church, and you've got this pastoral heart and this great history mind. You're a gift to our faith community. I wrote down as you were talking, we're better off with our LGBTQ members. And they help us create Zion. We're better off with our Black members fully participating. The church has grown. We've recognized that we're better off. They expand the borders of Zion. We're able to reach more people. We grow as a community. Being LGBTQ is not a bad outcome. Being Black is not a bad outcome. All of these people are equally loved, because our doctrine is all like unto God, as you talk in your book. And that's been a journey for me of proximity, to be proximate to LGBTQ Latter-day Saints and see the things you're talking about. Also, listeners have been uncomfortable at times with Black Latter-day Saints as I've interviewed them for podcasts. And I recognize sometimes my younger self would have said, well, that's just Satan entering the room because I'm uncomfortable. My older self says, well, that's you, Richard Ostler, recognizing the internalized racism you have about Black Latter-day Saints and this topic. And that's the work you need to do to unwind that from you. So, if you get uncomfortable reading Matt's book or hearing things on this podcast, I just gently invite you to consider that personal growth we all need to take to be better disciples of Christ and see each other the way God sees them. Also like to go back to my youth. I don't want to be a name dropper here, but I'm recognizing my dad, who's passed away, who was the bishop and stake president to Sterling McMurrin, who you talk in your book. and spoke at his funeral, and and had a very good relationship with Sterling McMurrin. And I kind of knew he's this eccentric guy in our ward that I didn't know how to talk to because I was a teenager, but I would, I just wish I could go back and my dad's gone and Sterling's gone and say, tell me about this relationship you had and the work that my dad did to, maintain a friendship, even that he even spoke at Sterling's funeral. And just, and there's so many other names you brought up in the book. Darius Gray is one of the few people I've met that you've talked about. And I was honored to be introduced to him by Tom Christofferson, Bill Evans, and hear his story and be proximate to somebody that joined the church before the priesthood ban. And to hear Darius' story that you know really well, Matt. And I encourage, you have to listen to Black Latter-day Saint stories, listeners. Matt and I are not Black. We don't know the pain that Black Latter-day Saints have felt. And so that we've done some podcasts with those, but I encourage you to read books and have experiences. And like that bishop did that pulled out his book, your book, Second Class Saints, that white bishop with that Black member, and how healing that would be for that Black member to know that proactively that bishop was reading that book and understanding the space, so that we all want to do the right thing. But we have to sometimes be untaught things we've learned in the past to be able to do the right thing. And that's one of the things your book does and others you've done. You're a great contributor to our faith community. And that's all I have to say. Do you have anything else you want to say, Matt?
I don't think so. I've just enjoyed our conversation today, Richard. It's a tough story, and I think you said it beautifully. It's hard to unlearn things. And scholarship, by its very definition, means that you're challenging predominant narratives. One of the narratives I'm challenging, obviously, is this idea that on June 1st, it just came out of the blue. That's just not true. It really speaks to President Kimball's marvelous leadership, that he was able to do, frankly, what his predecessors couldn't do, that he stuck to it. He felt this is what God wanted him to do. He saw what needed to be done to get the brethren on board, and he didn't give up, and he got the results that he needed. And I mean, that to me is his amazing leadership.
And talk, just in closing, I think you mentioned you're writing a book about Hugh B. Brown, who is somebody, do you want to share any timeline of when that might be done?
Oh boy.
I don't want to pin you
chapters into it.
Maybe it's 15 years.
Yeah. I'm hoping by the end of this year, I'll have a full draft done, but I'll tell you, there's a lot of interesting twists and turns in his life and his ministry and his relationship to the brethren. And I'll just give you one teaser.
Good.
President Brown, who was in the first presidency, he recognized that it's creating difficulty for the church to have elderly men like him running it. They're always sick. They're sleeping through meetings. And so he proposed in the early 70s that every general authority, including the apostles and first presidency, that they be retired at the age of 70. And he said, they're going to accept my proposal because I know that I drive some of my fellow brethren nuts, and I'll be the first one to go, and they're going to support it. Well, it wasn't until 1976, 77, where they actually, a year after he was dead, that they did accept it, but they didn't apply it to the 12. They applied it to everybody beneath the 12, including the quorums of the 70. And so that was a Hugh Brown proposal that he never saw to fruition. But anyway, he was a mover and a shaker, and he was a much different voice. He was a socialist from Canada. So that tells you that he didn't share the politics, both politically and theologically, from his fellow brethren, most of whom were from, Idaho, Arizona, and Utah. He had a different world perspective, and it's been refreshing to read about his goodness and his vision, and just everything about him is different. And I've so enjoyed my research on him, and I'm excited for this book to come out.
I'm glad you're writing that book and bringing these stories to life. And there's so many stories in this book about faithful Latter-day Saints at BYU and the Quorum of the 70. Elder Hanks is one you talk about. Institute teachers, and especially Black Latter-day Saints that navigated this, because it's really their story and their pain. So I encourage everybody to check out the book. We'll put it in the show notes. I'm grateful, Matt Harris, for being on the podcast, and I'm so grateful for the book you've written. And thank you all for listening to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.